He laughed at me during the all hands, called me obsolete, and bragged about replacing me with automation. In that moment, I said nothing. I didn't fight back. I didn't argue. I just smiled because I knew the truth. I was the one keeping 19,000 employees paid, and without me, the entire system would collapse. What he didn't realize was that by humiliating me publicly, he had already pressed the trigger. Hours later, chaos rippled through every division, and his downfall was broadcast live. Have you ever been humiliated at work? Comment yes below, and make sure you subscribe, because this is what happens when they underestimate the wrong person. It happened at 9:30 a.m. in front of 200 employees packed into the main conference hall. The CFO, Thomas Reynolds, stood on the stage, sleeves rolled up, voice booming into the mic like he was delivering a victory speech. Instead, he was mocking me. Payroll is legacy work, he said, smirking. Ruby still runs it like it's 1995. Obsolete systems, obsolete thinking. The crowd gave a nervous laugh, the kind people make when they're too scared not to. My name had just been dragged through the dirt in public, my life's work reduced to a punchline. I sat in the front row, heat rising in my face. Thomas locked eyes with me, enjoying it, savoring my humiliation. Automation will replace this old process, he added, raising his hand for effect. By next quarter, we'll be leaner, faster, finally free of outdated dependencies. Outdated. That word stung more than the laughter. He was stripping me of dignity in front of my peers, signaling that I was finished. My stomach twisted, but I didn't speak. I didn't argue. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. Because while Thomas thought he had won in that moment, he didn't know the truth. The system he mocked wasn't obsolete. It was mine. And by mocking me in front of everyone, he had already pressed the trigger on something he couldn't control. By 3 p.m., the entire company would learn just how obsolete I really was. Thomas thought payroll was a line item, a switch you flip once a month, something so ordinary it could be replaced by software sold in a glossy brochure. What he never realized was that the system wasn't a machine. It was a living structure I had built piece by piece, bound together with clauses, compliance codes, and checks designed to keep 19,000 employees paid accurately and on time. I never made speeches about it, never bragged in boardrooms, never asked for recognition. Instead, I embedded safeguards that tied every disbursement, every bonus, every vendor payment to my authorization. It wasn't vanity, it was protection. Protection against fraud, protection against oversight, protection against leaders who didn't understand the difference between efficiency and recklessness. Over the years, I became the quiet gatekeeper, the one who knew which levers moved what, the one vendors called when signatures didn't line up, the one HR trusted to make sure compliance reports didn't trigger government audits. And all of it, every login, every approval key, every vendor renewal was routed through Walker systems. The small LLCI had registered long before anyone like Thomas showed up with his buzzwords. Legal saw cost savings, finance saw clean numbers, IT saw reduced errors. No one looked closer, because why would they? In their minds, payroll was invisible, background noise. And that was the mistake. Because invisible doesn't mean powerless, it means underestimated. By the time Thomas mocked me on stage, the backbone he dismissed was already carrying the weight of the entire corporation. And if that backbone were ever pulled away, the collapse wouldn't come with a warning. It would come all at once, silent until the moment the floor gave out. The cracks began to show long before the lights went out, though Thomas was too busy preening to notice. After the all-hands, whispers traveled through the corridors, faster than any memo. People didn't repeat his jokes. They repeated the look on my face and the silence that followed. In payroll, silence means everything, and my team, Marcus and Lila, caught the signal. No raised eyebrows, no dramatic speeches, just a subtle nod over a spreadsheet that said, "It's time." Meanwhile, Thomas strutted through the office like a conquering hero, boasting to the board that his automation plan would save millions by cutting dead weight. He mistook fear for respect and compliance for loyalty, blind to the fact that the very staff he dismissed were quietly aligning with me. Department heads who had seen their budgets rescued by my interventions suddenly grew cautious, stalling on new initiatives, redirecting questions back to wait until payroll confirms. It was small at first, an expense report delayed, a travel reimbursement unanswered, a vendor contract renewal left unsigned. The dominoes hadn't fallen yet, but they were wobbling. Thomas, of course, ignored these tremors. He was too focused on polishing investor decks, slapping buzzwords like efficiency and disruption across slides that hid the growing unease under the surface. He thought the audience in that conference hall had laughed with him. In truth, they had laughed at their own discomfort, the kind that curdles into resentment. By mocking me, he hadn't undermined me. He had isolated himself. Because when trust fractures, it doesn't crack loud. It splinters quietly until one day the whole structure gives way. And that day was closer than Thomas could imagine. By noon, Thomas still believed he had won. He strutted through the executive floor, tossing out lines about new efficiencies and leaner systems, bragging to anyone who would listen that by next quarter he'd cut payroll costs by 20%. He didn't notice that the very people he depended on were shrinking away from him, eyes flicking toward me when he passed, measuring his arrogance against my silence. At 12:15, I sat at my desk, opened a single document buried deep in the compliance vault, and entered a code that only I knew. It wasn't dramatic, just a keystroke, one line of authorization revoked. That was all it took, because tied to that keystroke was a clause no one else had bothered to read. Vendor access lapsed automatically if my role was terminated, reassigned, or publicly undermined. Thomas had done all three in the space of 10 minutes on that stage. The system did the rest. At 12:47, the first signal appeared. A payroll batch flagged as pending authorization. IT assumed it was a glitch, filed a ticket, and went back to their sandwiches. At 1:05, managers began emailing HR about expense cards being declined. At 1:20, a regional director texted me directly, "Ruby, is payroll frozen?" I didn't reply. By 1:30, bonuses that had been queued for senior staff failed to disperse. The executive assistant, the CEO, stormed into finance with her phone in hand, furious that the quarterly bonus pool hadn't landed. Thomas waved her off, told her automation was adjusting. At 1:50, the first factory foreman called corporate, reporting that hourly workers had noticed missing deposits. By 2:10, union reps were demanding explanations. What Thomas didn't realize was that this wasn't a crash. It was a lock. Every disbursement, every bonus, every paycheck required vendor authorization, and that vendor link lived and died with me. IT tried to override, but the access keys didn't trace back to any company account. They traced back to Walker Systems, my LLC, invisible on the surface, but woven into every line of contract code. I had built it to protect against external fraud, never imagining I'd use it like this. But when you're mocked in front of 200 people, the lines between defense and offense blur. By 2:30, panic had spread across every floor. Employees refreshed bank apps, managers fielded angry calls, and Thomas still insisted it was nothing. He had no idea the ground beneath him had already vanished. At 3 o'clock, the payroll freeze completed its sweep. 19,000 employees unpaid, bonuses suspended, executive perks revoked. The hum of the office turned electric with fear, and I sat perfectly still, watching the numbers stall, knowing that the trigger had been pulled and nothing could stop what came next. By the time the clock struck 3:05, the building was vibrating with a panic Thomas could no longer disguise. Phones rang without pause. Slack threads exploded, and the hum of printers spitting out emergency reports filled the air like a heartbeat out of rhythm. I sat at my desk with my hands folded, watching as finance assistants scrambled between cubicles, whispering about missing deposits and frozen cards. Thomas barreled down the hallway, barking at IT to reset the servers, insisting the problem was a technical hiccup. But it wasn't a hiccup. It was the system working exactly as designed. Only without me to authorize it, the arteries of the company had clotted. By 3:20, store managers from across the country were calling headquarters demanding answers. Hourly workers had already noticed their paychecks missing, some leaving their posts mid-shift, others gathering in break rooms furious and confused. One manager shouted through the phone so loudly I could hear it across the office. If people don't get paid today, they walk tonight. At 3:35, HR tried to reassure staff that deposits would clear by evening, but their own employees were refreshing bank apps in disbelief, watching zeros remain where rent money should have been. The hypocrisy was almost poetic. HR preaching calm while their own paychecks were locked in limbo. At 3:47, the first vendor threatened to cut service unless invoices were paid, unaware that even vendor payments were tied to the same frozen pipeline. By 4 o'clock, the CFO's inbox was drowning in red flags. Compliance violations, overdraft risks, breach warnings from banks. He slammed his office door, sweat blooming across his collar, and demanded a full report. IT returned within minutes, pale and shaking, telling him there was no override, no back door, no hidden switch. They couldn't find the root access because it wasn't registered under any corporate profile. Every key pointed back to Walker Systems, my name buried in the contract metadata, invisible until someone cared to look. At 4:20, the CEO demanded a live status update, dialing into a call with top executives. Thomas spun jargon about system optimization delays and unexpected vendor latency, throwing words around like camouflage. But as he blustered, the CFO's assistant handed him a sheet of paper. Projected liabilities had reached $190 million if payroll didn't clear by end of day. He blanched, voice faltering, but kept talking, convinced volume could drown truth. By 4:45, employees began walking out of the building, not with dramatic protests, but with quiet resignation. Some left post-it notes on desks. Pay us, then talk. Others simply rolled their badges into tight coils and dropped them into lobby bins. I saw Marcus slip out the side door, phone in hand, already coordinating with Lila to gather key staff who trusted me more than the company. They didn't need instructions. They had seen this coming long before Thomas did. 5 o'clock, the investor hotline was flooded. Calls from hedge funds, pension groups, and private equity partners demanded answers, some threatening to pull capital unless assurances were given immediately. In the trading chat rooms, whispers spread. Payroll collapse, internal sabotage, CFO mismanagement. Stock price flickered, then dropped. By 5:20, the general counsel entered the executive floor carrying a binder, thicker than any of Thomas's glossy pitch decks. She placed it in front of him, opened to a page highlighted in yellow, and said flatly, "This is the clause. Vendor authorization tied to Ruby Walker. Term rolling. No termination authority without her consent." The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that breaks men louder than shouting ever could. Thomas tried to protest, stammering that I was just an employee, that the company had ownership. The counsel slid another page forward, this one signed by him years ago during a routine renewal, his own signature approving the clause without reading it. The room seemed to shrink around him. By 5:45, legal confirmed what I already knew. They couldn't force payroll without me. The liability was theirs. The control was mine. In the hallways outside, employees streamed toward elevators, the building hollowing out floor by floor, the sound of heels and shoes against tile echoing like a retreat. By 6 o'clock, the last update before the board meeting hit inboxes. Payroll authorization pending. Estimated liabilities, $190 million, vendor access unavailable. Panic had bloomed into certainty. The dominoes had fallen and Thomas was buried beneath them. And still, I hadn't spoken a single word. At 6:15 p.m., the investor call went live, the kind of emergency session usually reserved for natural disasters or government raids. Thomas sat at the head of the conference table, his tie loosened, eyes darting toward the blinking camera light that meant every word he spoke was being broadcast to board members, institutional investors, and analysts waiting with sharpened knives. His opening was the usual jargon, a desperate attempt to frame the situation as a temporary vendor disruption. His voice pitched higher than usual, betraying the cracks he couldn't conceal. The first question hit like a hammer. Why are 19,000 employees unpaid? He stumbled, muttered about system recalibrations, promised resolution within 24 hours. The silence that followed wasn't acceptance. It was investors waiting for blood. The second question cut deeper. Is it true that payroll authorization requires a third party named Walker Systems? His jaw tightened, sweat glistening under the conference lights. He tried denial, but the general counsel sitting 2 chairs away cleared her throat and leaned toward her microphone. That is correct. The authorization clause was approved by finance. The system cannot legally disburse funds without Ms. Ruby Walker's consent. The words detonated like a grenade. Faces on the video grid froze, jaws slack, eyes narrowing. For the first time, Thomas had no jargon thick enough to cover the truth. He raised his voice, claiming sabotage, painting me as a disgruntled employee, but the investors weren't buying it. They had documents in front of them, scanned copies of agreements he himself had signed, his initials scrawled next to terms he'd never read. One board member, an oil magnate notorious for his temper, leaned close to his webcam and said, "You signed away control of payroll." "You are responsible for this collapse," Thomas sputtered, pounding the table, shouting that he was misled, but his voice cracked under the weight of reality. Another board member, calm as ice, asked, "Do we even have operating liquidity tomorrow?" The CFO hesitated, then admitted they didn't. That was the end. Investors began exiting the call one by one, silent departures more devastating than any argument. The stock price ticked downward in real time, the company hemorrhaging credibility faster than cash. Thomas looked around the room, desperate for an ally, but even HR stared at her hands, unwilling to meet his eyes. At 6:45, the chairman of the board spoke, her tone final and cold. "Thomas Reynolds, this board has lost confidence in your leadership. We request your resignation effective immediately." his face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing like a man drowning. For a moment, I thought he might refuse, might cling to his title like a life raft, but then the last shred of fight left him. He clicked the button to leave the call without a word. No speech, no farewell, no spin. Just a man erased in real time. The silence afterward was suffocating, the kind of silence that marks the end of an empire. I sat at my desk miles away, watching the notification ping across my screen. CFO Thomas Reynolds resigns effective immediately. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. I simply closed my laptop knowing that the public downfall he feared most hadn't been orchestrated by protests, press leaks, or lawsuits. It had been delivered by his own arrogance, signed into existence years ago, and detonated the moment he mocked me in front of 200 people. His downfall wasn't my voice. It was his silence when confronted with the truth. The morning after Thomas's resignation, the office felt like a hollow shell of itself. Desks abandoned, inboxes overflowing with unanswered messages, and executives circling like vultures with no plan beyond survival. I didn't go back. Instead, I walked into a modest co-working suite across town, where Marcus and Lila were already setting up laptops on folding tables. The sign on the door was temporary, but the entity behind it was real. Walker Payroll Systems, LLC. No fanfare, no press release, just the three of us and a clean set of contracts ready to carry forward the same backbone Thomas had tried to erase. By noon, the first emails rolled in from clients who didn't hesitate. "We'll be moving with Ruby. Please send updated billing details." One message after another filled the inbox until the system pinged with more work than the three of us could handle alone. By late afternoon, I had already drafted new offer letters, signed vendor agreements, and secured benefits continuity. The people who trusted me didn't care about logos or letterhead. They cared that their paychecks arrived, that compliance was clean, that silence meant stability. That night, the old company finally reached out, a terse email from the CEO himself, asking if I would consult during the transition. I typed 7 words, "Send it to the firm. Standard rates apply." Then I closed the message and never looked. I don't see it as a tale of triumph over Thomas or even the company itself. What I see is a reminder that invisible work, the kind people take for granted until it disappears, is where real power lives. For years, I was called support, treated as background noise while executives chased headlines and buzzwords. But in the end, the backbone I built outlasted all their swagger. The lesson isn't that revenge should burn everything down. It's that sometimes the most powerful response is to step back and let arrogance collapse under its own weight. What happened to Thomas wasn't me destroying him. It was me refusing to hold up the floor he stood on. He mocked what he didn't understand, and the silence that followed was enough to prove who really carried the weight. The truth is, most of us have been in Ruby's position at some point, overlooked, undervalued, even humiliated. Maybe not in front of 200 people, but in small ways every day. And the message I'd offer is this: prepare quietly. Build structures that protect your worth and don't waste energy fighting every insult. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's in the quiet confidence that when you step away, others will finally see what you were holding up all along. How to get started today. Document your contributions. Keep proof of the value you create. Build relationships that last beyond titles or departments. Learn the fine print, contracts, agreements, systems, because knowledge is leverage. Invest in yourself outside of work so you're never trapped by one job. Before you leave, tell me in the comments, have you ever been underestimated at work? Share your story, hit that subscribe button, and let's make sure voices like ours are never ignored again.